Hi again. This is Sari Rosenberg, and guess what? We've made it to assignment 5, thinking critically about writing. In this assignment, you're going to be asked to choose a short story, play, or poem, relying upon your own analysis and literary critics you find. Identify possible bias, political, gender-based, racial, etc. Demonstrate how the author reveals this bias or ideological predisposition. If you have the textbook, there's literary criticism inside the textbook that you can look up, and it will show you examples. Then explore literary criticism that either supports or refutes the view that bias does in fact exist or suggests another inherent meaning. Provide a cogent, logically reasoned thesis you can support with evidence through an informed discussion. What that's telling you is follow the same rules that we've done all along. You'll have a thesis, which is going to say that the author is biased in some way, and basically you're going to end up proving it. You'll have your thesis statement as your last sentence or towards the end of your first introductory paragraph, and that then carries the idea throughout the entire essay. You can use any, and I want to make this so very, very clear. You can use any story you like, any play you like, any novel you like, any poem you like. I'm going to be discussing 3 examples only because I happen to think that they're good examples for this, and you're welcome to use any ones that you want. The full details of the stories will be in other videos, these PowerPoint videos, where I will explain in entirety the story itself. One is The Loudest Voice by Grace Paley. The other one is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Stetson. And one is Everyday Use by Alice Walker. The Loudest Voice is a story about a Jewish family, and there's a certain sense of bias within that because the characters come from a Jewish perspective. The Yellow Wallpaper is about a woman who goes through postpartum depression in the 1800s and the way her husband, the doctor, deals with it by being in denial, because at that point nobody took it seriously, women's mental health issues, and there was a bias in that. And Everyday Use by Alice Walker is from an African American perspective. Literary criticism, you can read this slide yourself, and basically what it's trying to do is answer the age-old question: do authors reflect culture and society, or does society move in the direction of authors' agenda? Think of it, let's put it this way that you can, when designer, let's look at it this way, take it out of the genre of writing and literature for a moment. Let me give you an example of clothing. Do designers, when they design, do they design for reflecting the culture of the people, or do their designs influence the general mass population? So that is it, that they design yellow outfits because everybody wants to wear yellow, or is everybody wearing yellow because they've put yellow in their collection? So it's the same thing with literature. There was a time where there were things that were just not spoken about in media, and there, if you go back to especially like the 1950s, where everything was perfect. Everything was swept under the carpet, and people really didn't talk about issues in certain generations. So did the problems exist within society? So when authors wrote, were they reflected, and they didn't mention the depths of issues that go on within a society? Were times actually better then, or are, now that everybody's talking about it in their literature and on media and so on, authors keep writing about it? Or are things worse because everybody's writing about it, and that causes people to become desensitized and to be involved with things that are inappropriate? And that, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know that we know as a society the answer. But nevertheless, our job and our objective is to get you to think And that's really what my purpose is here, is to get you to reflect not only on and to repeat what critics are saying, but when you write from your own viewpoint, I want you to start questioning what you see around you in order for you to be a better writer. And for you to be able to form opinions means that you need to look at the world on a deeper level. Critiquing. It is imperative to understand what a critique paper really is. When your teacher asks you to write a critique, they're asking you to analyze and evaluate and not just summarize. Mistake that a lot of students make is that they're just retelling the story. Critiquing and analyzing is saying, well, what does it mean when the character does this certain action? What's the underlying theme or meaning that's behind it? A critique is rather an essay or article that criticizes literary or other work. Make sure you're completely familiar with the following before critiquing the book or work: the author, the author's background. So important. Many people write and don't understand that if you took off a little bit of time to actually read the short story completely, maybe more than once, you would be able to write about it differently than if you don't. So that really getting to know the work and being comfortable with the characters is the very, very first step in being able to criticize it. Also, it's good to look at the author and the background of the author and to understand the viewpoint from which the author comes, and that's, again, the author's background. Critiquing. A critique in this case answers the question of, how does the author present the characters? Stereotypically, objectively, does the character represent the everyman, or is he a caricature of a particular culture? In other words, when you're dealing with, let's go back to something simple. Cinderella. Cinderella is a stereotype. She's very one-dimensional. She's this perfect character. She is stereotypical in that she represents, this iconic, she's a Barbie doll that moves, essentially. Almost brainless in that regard. So she is stereotypical. Does she represent the every person? No, because she doesn't have multi-dimensions. We don't really know anything else about her. So that is an evaluation. Is there a clear agenda or bias from the author? Let me go back to Cinderella, where the characters are very black and white. Well, there is a clear agenda to portray the stepmother as being evil. There's nothing redeeming about the character of the stepmother. She is stereotypical in the way she behaves, and so the author is trying to give the message across to the child that's listening to the story. Stepmothers are bad people, and a child will listen to the story of Cinderella and walk away with a clear message. How well does the author accomplish his or her goal? In the case of Cinderella, I think pretty well. A critique does not mean criticizing the work in a negative sense, but rather interpreting it as you see it, so that you don't have to love or hate the story. You have to come in objectively and say, based on what I'm looking at from the author's perspective, this is what the author is trying to say. It usually combines both positive and negative. So there are some things that I did like and some things I didn't like. The first step is to analyze the piece of work. Discuss the author's main point of view and his purpose. See who he's performing for, who is his audience. Check for any underlying biases or assumptions in the work that the author produces. How does the author's background affect his viewpoint? I think that audience is probably very important here. Just like we did in English Comp 101 in terms of analyzing news stories and analysis of news editorials, based on the audience that they know that they're going to be writing to. It's when somebody produces a work commercially and they're trying to affect society as a whole, the audience is every person. It becomes a little bit more complicated than that. The next step is to plan and write your critique. You should do this in standard essay form. In the first paragraph, you need to introduce the topic, state the thesis, give a plot summary, and give your readers a clue what they are to expect. I think also that it's important to have in your introduction some kind of wow statement that sometimes students leave out, but that introductory attention grabber to the reader, to the audience, in this case it's the evaluator of your papers, is very good. It's important to remember. An introduction also includes the background of the piece of work that you're going to critique. Include the name of the author and a bit of information about him or her that pertains to the argument that you're making. Always keep it focused. An introduction includes the basic theme and the names of the main characters. All the information that you give, whether it's mentioning the characters or anything else, I would like you to please remember that everything is going to be based on your thesis statement. I think it's important to write your thesis statement first and then work backwards. Don't write this whole introduction and then your thesis statement. Write your thesis statement first and then choose information from the author and the character where everything is then going to relate to this point that you're making in your thesis. It's much easier. It's actually much easier to do it that way. In the second part of the critique, you'll have to introduce the character, setting, and give a lot of detail, only as it relates to your thesis. So let me just put that in as I speak. I'm just going to change that in here because I don't like that they didn't put that in as it relates to the thesis. So you don't give me a whole plot summary all over again and tell me everything that what's going on in the story. Everything relates to, it is focused on your thesis and what you're trying to prove. Bring out the author's important points and evaluate the evidence provided by the author supports his point of view, so that points of the story that you're picking out are only related to the point that you're trying to prove. Is this author biased? Is this story biased in some way? And those are the examples that you'll pull out of the story. Break the thesis and different parts of the story into separate points and examine each point separately. A very important thing that will strengthen all your arguments is giving real examples from the piece of work you are using. Critical review critique, just to go over some things here. Does a direct thesis convey both the subject and the reviewer's value judgment? And that's what this is. Don't forget that this is an assignment about bias. Does the review provide a summary or description to help you experience the piece of literature? No places where the author provides too much or too little detail. Does the essay clearly identify relevant criteria for evaluation? Are they appropriate, believable, and consistent? Are any important features of the reviewed subject omitted? Logos, does the essay provide sufficient, relevant, and interesting details and examples to adequately inform and entertain? Ethos, does the author's judgment seem sound and convincing? You can read this yourself. Let me put this in English to English for you. Hold on. Listen. Follow. This is not about the story. This is about when you're looking at Spark Notes, short stories for students, or you go online and you take out and you find a piece of analysis on the story. You have to look at and evaluate the critique itself. So there are really three parts to this. There's the story itself. Then there's your analysis, whether or not you think the author is biased and the place that you're coming from. And then the third part is you're also evaluating not only the story, but you're evaluating the evaluation of the story to see if what perspective or what agenda does that analyst have. Okay, let me explain. There's a book called The Cinderella Myth, an entire book based on tearing apart Cinderella. the author comes from the perspective, when analyzing the story of Cinderella, that women in our society are influenced by the idea of Cinderella, and that adult women in their 20s and in their 30s, still are always looking for that Prince Charming to save them. It's from a very feminist point of view. That author had a point of view based on the story of Cinderella. You can then take that kind of book, well, in this case we're only doing short stories, I wouldn't bother going through the whole book, but you're going to take an analysis and say the author is coming from a very feminist point of view and is perhaps overanalyzing the whole story of Cinderella, and that Cinderella is a simple fairy tale, doesn't seem to have any great agenda. It's talking about this sad little girl who's somehow saved by a fairy godmother. Move on. What's this whole mishigas going on over here about this whole Cinderella myth? You can do that, so what you would be doing in an essay is saying, yes, here's the story of Cinderella. I don't see all of this, but there's a critique on it where there's an author's viewpoint that comes from the perspective of feminism. That's what I'm trying to bring in here, and that's the whole point of the essay. So it's not only you can take it from the viewpoint where you're discussing the story itself, and does the story itself have a bias, and sometimes the story itself does have a clear bias, and you can also agree or disagree with the author that's bringing in criticism to that story. So you can make it as complicated. I know it sounds very complicated, and you're thinking, what is this woman talking about? She's rambling again. I've been through 4 of these, and now I'm on this 5th one, and she doesn't stop. I want to make it really, really clear to you what this essay is about, so that you're analyzing the story, and sometimes it's black and white, what the story's, the message of the story. In the story, when you go into the loudest voice, and you review this, what I'm going to be speaking about is there are criticisms from a non-Jewish perspective that love the story. As an Orthodox Jew, I disagree with some of the critics, because I'm saying culturally you don't understand what this author is trying to say, because you don't have the same experience. It's the very same thing could be done with the yellow wallpaper, where when you look at the yellow wallpaper, you can say, this is, if you're a male and you're reading the yellow wallpaper, you might have a different perspective than a female who's looking at this and saying, oh yes, I know people, I can relate to these women who went through postpartum, I know people who've gone through that and who've had issues, where you can say, but as a man looking at that, and you can look at it and say, the woman was just nuts and she deserved to be put away. And if you're talking about the last one, where in everyday use, coming from the African American and from the black experience, well, how can you relate to that? Because you can't walk in the shoes of the author. So therefore, in evaluating the criticism, to look at, let's use everyday use. Is the critic taking it from an African American perspective, or is it taking from the white experience, and evaluating the story based on that, where there might be 2 different opinions? Or do they come on common ground, because you say, now you as the analyst say, I disagree with that, because I'm looking at the story from a totally different perspective, and this is where your opinion does count, and we are looking for your opinion and for you to analyze the story, where you can say, as a human being, as somebody who comes from a very strong culture, may not be African American, but comes from a strong culture, where I might side with one perspective over another and see that there's a bias here, or then I'll explain all of that later. So we're now at the end. of assignment number 5, and I'm going to leave you on your own, as always, to look at the conventions of writing about literature, and that will all be explained to you. This is Dr. Sari Rosenberg signing off again and seeing you one more time on lesson number 6. Have a great day.